and in the middle of the 60s, especially, were in protest against the Vietnam War. There were also a lot of protests around the British presence in British influence in its former African colonies, both in South Africa in terms of protests against the system of apartheid, and about Rhodesia. Indeed, the first sit-in at the London School of Economics in 1967 had been against the appointment of Walter Adams, who had been a chancellor at Rhodesia's main university, and he became appointed as the director of the LSE. Worse still, Adams had actually supported the Prime Minister of Rhodesia's, Ian Smith's, Declaration of Independence from Britain in 1965, which was a declaration of independence designed to try and maintain the continuation of the white settler rule over the majority African population. But the real student protests began in 1967 in the London School of Economics, and they spread to places like the University of Essex and Manchester in 1968. Key figures in these student protest movements are themselves post-colonial intellectuals. Probably the most famous is Tariq Ali, who had been born and raised in Lahore, went to the University of Oxford, became head of the Student Union there in 1965, went on to be one of the big editors of Black Dwarf from 1968, alongside Sheila Rowbottom, who becomes an important figure in the feminist movement, as we'll see in a little bit. Another key figure here is Stuart Hall, who had moved to the UK from Jamaica in 1951 as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, and became, as we saw last week, a key figure in the development of cultural studies at the University of Birmingham, and a key intellectual in the New Left around figures like Edward Thompson as well. And finally, there are these two people that you see in this image behind me, which is from the LSE and the London School of Economics protest in 1967, which is René Chad and Bhaskar Vashki, both of whom were part of the Socialist Society at the London School of Economics, and both of whom Vashki had been a leader of the Students' Union at the University of Salisbury in Rhodesia, where Adams had been appointed. So in other words, the empire, or the ends of empire, have a really important role, I think, in the development of student protest in Britain. So too does the imperial or colonial position of Northern Ireland. If you're looking for something that looks like the civil rights movement in Britain, it happens in Northern Ireland. Remember that Ireland had been divided by the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1922 into into South and Northern Ireland. And in the north of Ireland, which remained under British rule, there was a two-thirds majority Protestant population and a one-third minority Catholic population. It was the movement to establish civil rights for the Catholic minority that I think comes closest to the black civil rights movement in the US. In 1968, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association is formed, and it had 5 basic demands. One man, one vote through all of local government, the end of gerrymandering of electoral districts that enable Catholic majorities to be split, the end to discrimination in public housing and in jobs, and the disbandment of the B specials of the Ulster Constabulary, which many people viewed as a sectarian organisation populated by Protestants. So again, an important role of Britain's old empire in the animation of student politics and civil rights. Any questions before we get into sex? The disbandment of the B specials, which was this branch of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was populated basically by Protestants. So let's start with this man.
Annus Mirabilis. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Up till then, there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then, all at once, the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP.
So this is Philip Larkin's famous poem, Annus Mirabilis, about the beginning of sexual intercourse in 1963. And sexual intercourse begins in 1963 for Larkin because it's the iconic moment where the contraceptive pill for women is commercially marketed. The key point that I want to get across to you here in this section of the lecture is that this is another great illustration of the fact that many of the processes of change that we associate with the 60s happened earlier, and many of them weren't entirely emancipative in their outcomes. So keep that in mind as we go through it. In fact, Philip Larkin had really got it wrong. The pill had been available to married women only from 1961. It was only available to non-married women from 1967. Nonetheless, between 1962 and 1969, the numbers of users rose from 50,000 to 1 million. So this clearly is the decade in which women's contraception becomes more reliable and at wider spread. But that has, I'm going to suggest, contradictory implications. It's not just about the emancipation of women from their reproductive functions. The other story that is slightly contradictory is the story of the decriminalisation of homosexuality for men, which begins with this report headed by Lord Wolfenden, that was a commission that was held between 1954 and 1957. And it began not as an attempt to decriminalise homosexuality, it began as a commission concerned with the problem of policing homosexual sex in Britain's cities. What it was basically concerned with was the fact that policing seemed to have failed to reduce the amount of public soliciting, especially in London. And so what the Wolfenden report does, very interestingly, is basically map all of gay London, all of the key sites of sort of cottaging and soliciting in London. And what it ends up doing is proposing decriminalisation in order to try and get these types of homosexual male encounters off the streets, to basically put them where they believe they should be, which was indoors in private. That was the recommendation of the Wolfenden report. In fact, decriminalisation doesn't happen, as we've already seen, until 1967. And if you lived in Scotland, it doesn't actually happen until 1980. And, of course, decriminalisation was only for men over 21, whereas the age of consent for heterosexual relations was 16. Nonetheless, the age of consent for homosexual men was reduced to 18 in 1994, and then finally to the same age as heterosexuals in 2000. I suggested earlier that the pill had sometimes contradictory consequences. And I think a key element of the so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s was the commodification of sex, and especially the sort of licensing of male heterosexual pleasure. This actually, I think, is really nicely illustrated in the development of Soho in London as a sort of commercial sexual space, which happens really during the 1950s, with a whole series of strip clubs and sort of backstreet brothels emerging effectively in coordination with the Metropolitan Police Force, who were taking bribes from the owners of these clubs. But it becomes iconically represented by the establishment, of course, of the Playboy Club. Somehow, the Playboy Club becomes a way of cementing the newfound respectability of not just Soho, but of the commercialization of sex. Another great example of this, I think, is the enormous popularity of the publication The Joy of Sex, which was the one book on my parents' shelf that I actually read as a kid. It was published in 1972, and it sold 12 million copies, outstripping even those publications that we talked about in the 1920s, like Married Love and Ideal Marriage. The interesting thing about The Joy of Sex was that the emphasis was not placed, as Mary Stopes had been, on the endless quest for the mutual orgasm. It was much more a book designed to show the variety of sexual positions that men and women could engage in. And it was written by an interesting figure known as Alex Comfort, who was an anarchist and a pacifist, who had been a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, as well as a medical doctor. The other part of this commercialization of sex was, of course, the transformation of women's fashion and of the ideal body type for women. Effectively, what the big transformation of this era was the shift from what is best illustrated, I think, by Elizabeth Taylor, that rounded, voluptuous body of Elizabeth Taylor that many people thought was, the perfect sign of the mother-in-waiting, to the figure of Twiggy. Twiggy, who became the Daily Express's Face of the Year in 1966, a new image of women as a figure of men's sexual attraction, and a whole new cast of clothing designed for this new, slight, feminine body. Okay, I'm going to talk now about the responses to this, which of course was the growth of so-called third-wave feminism, which in a way rises as a critique of many of these processes. Again, third-wave feminism had a very transnational flavour. Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex came out in France in 1949. Betty Friedan's Feminist Mystique came out in the US in 1963. But feminism in Britain, again, has its own particular flavour, and again, that flavour turns, I think, in important ways to the critique of the forms of the welfare state of the post-war period, a critique of the forms of domesticity inscribed in the welfare regime set up after the war, a critique of the sexualisation of women during the 1960s, and the continuing exclusions of women in the politics of class that many women experienced during the New Left politics and the student movements of the late 1960s. Indeed, in many ways, the third-wave feminism in Britain emerges out of a critique of the student movement and of New Left politics, which they argued aggravated the oppression of women because it was so uninterested in it. Key figure here in the British context is Sheila Rowbottom, one of the editors of Black Dwarf alongside Tariq Ali, and in 1969 she publishes Women's Liberation and the New Politics. It's followed the following year by Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. Greer is also a type of post-colonial intellectual. She moved to the UK in the middle of the 1960s from Sydney, Australia. She went to study at the University of Cambridge and wrote for Private Eye. I should have said in the stuff about comedy, almost all of those comedy shows came out of student dramatic organisations at the University of Cambridge or the University of Oxford. In other words, the very people critiquing the paternalism and the absurdity of the traditional ruling class in many ways came out of that same gentlemanly formation. They came out of Oxford and Cambridge and they went to work at the BBC. They were absolutely as much a part of the so-called intellectual aristocracy as anyone else. But the big moment in British feminism was the Miss World protest in 1970 at the Royal Albert Hall. And I'm going to have to play you this, just when you think you can get any lower. And their big slogan was, "We're not beautiful, we're not ugly, we're angry." This is a cattle market. This is a denigration of women. No matter how many brilliant books were written, it was this major protest and a sort of global television event that really launched the women's liberation movement in Britain. Yeah. No, it was an actual protest. It's not part of the act. It was an actual protest. The Women's Liberation workshop that happened in 1970 came out of the History Workshop movement that I was talking to you about last week. It was held at Ruskin College, Oxford, as an outgrowth of the History Workshop conference, and it elaborated the key demands of the Women's Liberation movement, which was equal pay, equal education and job opportunities, free contraception and abortion on demand, and free 24-hour nurseries. But the much more radical component in many ways of the Women's Liberation movement was its development of new forms of politics. And a really great example of that was the emergence of so-called consciousness-raising groups, which began in the US in 1968, began to take off in Britain in 1969. By 1971, there were 71 women's consciousness-raising groups. And the idea of these consciousness-raising groups was women would come together and share their experience, their individual experience, in order to better understand the collective conditions of women's oppression. So part of it was almost like an emotional support group, and part of it was an attempt to think politically and historically about the condition of women and the forms of politics that they should engage in. There were two key journals that came out of this movement. One was Shrew, which you see here. The other was Spare Rib, which is the front cover of which is on the table of contents of the lecture with John Cleese with his hand on a woman's backside. The other element of this was, of course, the attempt to discover women's historical position. And it's no coincidence that women's history emerges out of this movement. Sheila Rowbottom wrote Hidden from History, 300 Years of Women Oppression and the Fight Against It in 1973, and became really the sort of, the key architect of women's history in the UK. It was, though, quickly apparent that not all the women's liberation spoke with the same voice. That, for many women, looked at the women's liberation movement as being dominated by white women and often by white middle-class women. And it's in that contradistinction that the Brixton Black Women's Group emerges in 1973, emphasising that they had their own distinct concerns, which was about the unique position of black women in British society and their greater need for things like childcare, health and education, because they were battling racial discrimination as well as sexual oppression. The other movement of sexual liberation was, of course, the emergence of gay and lesbian politics in Britain. And again, in some ways, this develops in lockstep with the American story. Probably the clearest exception to that was the beginning of lesbian politics in the Lesbian Minorities Research Group, formed in 1963. This was a group of lesbian women who were subjects of the research of sexologists to try and understand the pathology of their condition. And these women began to founded a journal called Arena 3 in order to talk to each other about not just their experience of being subjects of sexological research, but also to try and share contacts and discussion of what it meant to be a lesbian in British society, remembering that same-sex relations between women had never been decriminalised in Britain because it was thought to be such a hideous crime that no one could even dare to speak about it. If it was to be spoken about, it would encourage women to have sex with each other. So they faced their own particular set of predicaments. More importantly, in terms of the visibility of gay politics, was these two organisations, the Campaign for the Committee of Homosexual Equality, formed in 1967 to reject the higher age of consent placed upon homosexual men by its decriminalisation, and the Gay Liberation Front, formed in 1970. The Gay Liberation Front basically took its inspiration from the sort of post-Stonewall politics emerging in New York and the US in 1969, and determined, unlike the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, which had a very legalistic sort of constitutionalist role, the Gay Liberation Front wanted to put gay politics onto the streets, to put gay men on the street and make them visible, and to raise the consciousness not just of other gay men and give them the courage to come out in the same way, but also to raise the consciousness of the British population as a whole. The first Gay Pride March in London took place in 1972, and it had the motto, out and proud. And about 700 men marched through London, as you can see here, alongside the banner for the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. Just as with the women's liberation movement, so with gay politics, a key part of the new political formation was to return to history, to animate the new politics. And the key figure here was Geoffrey Weeks, whose book, Coming Out, Homosexual Politics in Britain from the 19th Century to the Present, was published in 1977. I don't have time to play that. Let me move on to the final section of this lecture. Actually, I should play you this because it's a good link. This is Tom Robinson's Glad to Be Gay, which I remember very well as a kid in 1978. Okay, so you get the idea. This was like this is a song in the charts, on all the things. It was an amazing thing that gay politics was so visibly out, and even in the late 1970s, that seemed an incredibly powerful statement. And gay men singing about the continuing oppression that they received from police raids and the treatment of the other versions go on to treat regular people. Okay, let me finish up by talking about the music industry, effectively, which, of course, was absolutely central to the politics and culture of youth in the 1960s. But here, too, the story begins much earlier. I titled this Rebels Without a Cause because, of course, of the great James Dean film after that name of 1955. I could have made an Elvis play, of course, because Elvis was incredibly influential in terms of the development of rock and roll in Britain. Britain got its own highly lame versions of Elvis, in the figure of Tommy Steele, who you see here, and the even lamer image of Cliff Richard, who came to fame in 1959 and was a huge star long before he joined the Festival of Light in 1971. The fact that you get